Welcome back to Z-Speed. Now that we got this Honda all cleaned up, it's time to evaluate the front end and see if we can figure out exactly what happened to that drive axle. First thing I always do though before I work on anything is change the oil, because I want to make sure I've got nice new engine oil in before I do any startups. And as we can see here, I didn't notice this earlier, but we're missing a lug nut. So I looked at it a little closer and the whole thing has been snapped off. So we'll have to replace that along with all the other things we're going to be doing with this drive axle. And you can see it's pushed back quite far. So the first thing I will want to do is just get it up on jack stands, take the rims off and compare good side versus bad side. It's always a good place to start, just to see what it's supposed to look like versus what it looks like after the damage has occurred. So I've actually started the engine here and put it in neutral after I've got it up on jack stands, and that's a neat little trick. You can just do a free spin while the car's in neutral just to see what happens. We've got good turning here. I don't see any rubbing at all on the undamaged side. That's what we would expect. And now we're gonna go over to the damaged side and just see what kind of drag we've got. We know we've got contact somewhere on the drive axle, and it's very hard. Look, it does not even want to free spin at all. It will turn, that's the good news, and it's not contacting the knuckle here, so that's not the issue. It's not pushed up against the knuckle, but it's definitely dragging, most likely on the drive axle. Something's made contact with it, and I can pull it backwards as well, but it's a lot of drag on this, and I'm hoping that I didn't damage anything with just driving it home at this point. But we're gonna get these rims off next and take a really good look and see if we can do a comparison of good side versus bad side again. And I'm just looking at the orientation of the upper control arm, the strut tower, the ball joint, and just trying to get an idea of what it should look like, what kind of angles are involved here. And this all looks pretty clean, except for a little bit of rust there. But as far as damage goes, it looks good. No damage noted, and the knuckle looks good. You can see the drive axle orientation inside the fork. It pretty much goes right up the middle there. So I'm looking at that. And I'm also looking at the lower control arm where it mounts up to the frame here, or subframe. And it looks pretty good. I see a little bit of dry rot in that rubber bushing, but other than that, not bad. Now we're looking at the sway bar and the end link and the orientation of that to the drive axle. Looks pretty good here, and the lower control arm mounted to the subframe. Now let's go check out the other side and try to see if we can determine exactly what happened over there. Okay, so right off the bat, you can see that the ball joint on the upper control arm is facing towards the rear of the car. It should be actually pointed a little bit towards the front. So that is off kilter there, or bent back a little bit. And it could mean that the upper control arm's bent. But as I'm looking at where it bolts up to the subframe, I don't see any damage up there. So that's great that there's no damage to the actual bolts points to the frame. Now that we're looking down below, we can see that that drive axle is definitely pushed back towards the rear of this fork right here. So we're getting closer. And there you go. Can you see it? The looks like the sway bar and the end link are actually making contact with the drive axle. So that whole drive axle is pushed back and it's made contact with the sway bar there, and that can only mean that the lower control arm and the upper control arm are bent back. That's definitely one of the problems, and it could be a bent fork as well. It could be a bent strut. Kind of hard to tell at this point, but at least we know what's making contact with what. It's basically the sway bar and end link making contact with the drive axle. So I wanted to do one more quick comparison of the position of the knuckle, upper control arm, and strut on the damaged side. This is what we're looking at, the damaged side here, and compare it to the undamaged side. And you can see everything's kind of pushed back towards the rear of the car. This is the undamaged side, and you can see everything's kind of faced towards the front of the car. So the angles are completely different on the undamaged side versus this damaged side over here, where everything is pointed back. You can see it's quite severely damaged. So to be safe, I think I'm just going to replace the whole strut, the upper control arm, the lower control arm, and might as well get the inner and outer tie rods while I'm at it. So just a quick assessment of the front of the frame. It looks good. It's scraped up there, but not damaged too badly. Now where the radiator meets the little subframe up front, that's bent up, and you can see they zip tied the actual front of the bumper to that because they can no longer attach it with those push pins. But not a problem. The radiator's not leaking. It's still working correctly. So we're more focused on getting this damaged upper and lower control arm fixed at this point. And we're gonna look a little bit closer at this sway bar and end link now. So I've decided to detach the end links and pull the sway bar back, and it worked great, and I was able to get a free spin on the drive axle. And so now I want a second opinion because I'm no frame expert at all, and I'm going to take it up to the local Pet Boys up here. They've got a little deal where you can pay them 22 bucks plus or 23 bucks, and they will tell you what they think is wrong with your suspension, and you really can't beat that. That's pretty cheap, and I want to see what they come up with versus what I think is wrong, and we'll go from there. And in case you're wondering, yes, you can drive without the sway bar connected. It feels a little squirrely, but it's still drivable. And after the evaluation, Pet Boys decided that the only thing they could find wrong was a bent lower control arm. I was very surprised that was it. So I went ahead and hit everything with PB Blaster. And I've decided to change out the whole suspension anyway because it's got 190,000 miles on it. It's quite old. We're gonna hit the inner and outer tie rods, the lower ball joint, the upper control arm, the lower control arm, struts, you name it, everything's gonna be redone. I found a really good deal on eBay for about 155 bucks after taxes. So let's give it a try. So at this point you can see I got that bottle of PB Blaster out, and I pretty much hit every bolt in the front suspension area. We're gonna let it soak for at least 30 minutes. I don't know what kind of condition these bolts are in, and I sure don't want to snap one off while trying to repair this. So let it soak in for a bit, and you can see there is the sheared off lug nut bolt, and that's gonna be actually pretty easy to repair. I picked one up at AutoZone, and you really just have to tap it out and then put the lug nut on and tighten it back on. It pulls it right back through. We'll do that a little bit later. I didn't actually film that part, but it's pretty easy, and I'll try to give you some more information on that in a second. So we're gonna start by removing all of the cotter pins, and there's three. There's one up top on the upper part of the knuckle you saw, and there is one on the outer tie rod, a little one right there, and we got one more on the lower ball joint to the knuckle. Let's see if I can pull that up. There she is right there. So we just remove all those cotter pins. I like to save the cotter pins so I can compare them size-wise. So when I go to replace them, I have a little cotter pin kit with several different sizes, and I can just match up the size. So go ahead and don't be afraid to destroy those, because you are not going to want to reuse those at all. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and remove the brake line from the knuckle, and I like to take these bolts out and then pull the little brace away and replace the bolts back in their little holes, because I don't want to lose any of this hardware. It's a lot easier when you go to reassemble everything if the bolts are already back in the bolt holes and you just kind of remove and tighten. So now we've got the upper and lower bolts for the brake caliper itself. We just need to break those loose and then suspend the caliper so we don't put any tension on the brake line. And there's plenty of places to suspend it with a bungee cord, or you can use a bucket if you'd like and just put it on a bucket. I had to use a rubber mount to break mine loose. It's kind of old as far as the brake shoes go, and so is the brake disc. I'm probably going to replace the shoes and the disc because it's just kind of old and rusty, and I'm going to start off with a fresh brake setup since I'm going and redoing the entire suspension as well. So it takes me a minute to find a decent place to hang it, but like I said, there's lots of options up there. Okay, we should be taking the rotor off next, and there should be two small screws holding that on. Somebody's already removed those and they left them off when they changed it last time, so I don't have to worry about that. So problem solved there. And now we're going to lube up the bolt for the lug nut. Remember we talked about that being sheared off, and so I'm going to hit it really good on both sides with some PB Blaster and let that soak for a little bit because we're going to have to tap that out a little bit later. And we definitely want that to soak in for a while because I'm sure there's quite a bit of rust. As you can see, the drive axle nut has a little kink or a little crimp in it, so we're going to slowly knock that out. I'm going to be very careful not to damage my screwdriver or your center punch, whatever you're going to use to get this little crimped area out. We just need to get it semi-straight so we can get that whole nut to spin. So take your time and tap that out, or get as close as you can to being tapped out. Okay, I've already tapped out the lug nut. I just spun around to an area where the dust cover was not sitting in front of and tapped it right out. And now I'm going to remove the dust cover using that hole. I'm not sure how you're gonna be able to do it without tapping out a lug nut, but there's probably a way. This is really easy for me to take that little hole and just spin it to an area where there's just two little screws holding this dust cover on, and I just lined it up and then disconnected those. The main reason I'm disconnecting the dust cover is because now I'm ready to remove the outer tie rod, and this dust cover is in the way of getting my fork in there to break the outer tie rod loose, and it's definitely stuck again. So I was able to remove the dust cover, spin it around out of my way so I can get this fork in here and break the outer tie rod loose. Just remember when you're removing the outer tie rod to count the revolutions so we have a rough guide of where we're at when we go to reinstall it. Obviously it's not going to be perfect because we're redoing the whole suspension, but at least it'll be drivable when you reattach your tie rod. Okay, now at this point it's going to take a 32mm socket to remove this axle nut, and we're ready to do that. But I'm showing this footage because this is a total fail here, and hopefully you watched this video before you attempted this whole job. Now I've already obviously removed the brake caliper, and what I did not know is that even with the transmission in park, this drive axle will spin backwards and forward, so it is impossible to use a breaker bar to break this axle nut loose. So if you don't have an impact gun, which luckily I do, then you have to have somebody sitting in the cabin with their foot on the brakes holding it tight so you can break the axle nut loose. And honestly, I'm not even sure, even with the brakes on, that it would keep it from spinning or not. I never tried it, but I think that'd be your only way to break that nut loose and keep it from spinning, is having somebody with their foot on the brakes. So before you even take the brake calipers off, you need to do that. Now, once I got back and realized that this thing was not gonna go just spin right off because it was moving forward and backward. Then I got my impact gun out and I didn't show it, but I just turned it on high and this thing just spun it right off. Thank goodness, because I was at a loss of what to do next because I could not get it to lock up at all and break loose. And luckily, if you do have an impact gun, it will just spin that thing right off. Time to remove the speed sensor. There's a 10mm bolt right there and one right up here. Remove those two. The speed sensor slides right out. You can see I've taken the castle nut off of the upper control arm right there. And I've also taken the castle nut off the lower ball joint down below and slightly removed the fork bolt. And I'll show you more of that in a minute. Okay, now I've got my pickle fork out once again. I'm going to try to separate the knuckle from the lower control arm, and you really have to pound this thing hard. I will try to link a ball joint separator down below. I don't have one of those, so I'm using a pickle fork, and then you can see I'm tapping the bottom of the ball joint, and then what really worked great, and you can see it pop loose right there, awesome, is when I tapped it right there. I had tapped the lower control arm right on the side there with that ball peen hammer, and that really helped break those threads loose. Okay, what I'm not showing here is I'm hitting the upper knuckle and breaking that loose from the upper control arm, and you can see it separated there. And all I did was use a ball peen hammer to, I don't know if you can see that little tiny nick right there on the bottom of the knuckle, but I hit it right there with the ball peen hammer and knocked up on that bolt, and boom, they separated. You can always use a pickle fork if you need to. Okay, at this point I want to separate the knuckle from the lower control arm, and all you really have to do is grab a rubber mallet and tap up on the ball joint, and it should knock it out of the lower control arm, and it worked quite well. No problems there. I'll show you a quick view of that. There it is, it's out. And now I was going to try to separate the drive axle from the bearing assembly, and I thought I could just tap that out. I used a rubber mallet, that didn't work. Use a ball peen. You don't really want to go crazy with the ball peen because you could damage the threads on the drive axle, so that didn't work either. There's a bit more rust than I thought, and we're going to have to use a different method because I don't want to damage the drive axle at all. So what we're going to do is use a puller here, and I'm going to show you how to use that in just a second. So I actually picked this puller up from AutoZone, but you can also get them from Amazon. I'll link it below. This worked out perfect. It's got a little divot right in the center of the drive axle where that little rod hooks right into, and you can see I've got it set up, and then you just grab your ratchet and just twist it right off, and it pulled it right out. Okay, I'm hoping you're having as much fun as I am right now. We're almost there though, so hang in there. We got to pull that bolt out. You can see sticking out right there, and pull that out of the lower control arm. That will release the fork from the strut, and then we can go ahead and separate the lower control arm from the frame. Then we can go up, drop the strut down so we can access the upper bolts to the upper control arm, and we are completely done with the suspension except for the inner tie rod. So to access the bolt on the lower control arm towards the rear of the car is you just have to lift up on the sway bar right there. So lift that sway bar up. You'll have clear access at that point to go ahead and ratchet that bolt out. And I had a little bit of corrosion on it, but it wasn't too bad. It came out pretty easily. You can see a little corrosion there when I pulled it out. And then we can just get the bolt in the front, which we have clear access to. There's nothing really in our way. And it's quite a long bolt, so it takes you a little while to ratchet this one out. So take your time and it will come out, but it's a long guy here and it's a lot of twisting involved. Okay, now we're ready to remove the lower control arm. And when I started to, I realized, oh, we need some type of support for the drive axle. So you grab yourself a bungee, another bungee, and strap it up somewhere up in the fender well, and you can suspend that so it doesn't dangle. You just don't want that drive axle dangling. And then you're free to go ahead and separate that lower control arm. And it should come out pretty easily. And mine did, no problems there. Popped it right on out. The amazing thing was those guys from Pet Boys were right on the money. Check out the difference between the new and the old lower control arm. You can see the lower control arm, the old one is on the bottom. The bends are amazing on this thing. It is completely off here. It's not even really close. It looks like it could be from another car or something because it's bent so badly. And this angle down here was so far off. I mean, it was bent down and bent back. I mean, it didn't really resemble the original control arm. The bends were so bad. So hats off to the guys at Pet Boys. They really called that one. It was bent all to pieces here. Okay, before taking the upper control arm out, it's a whole lot easier if you remove the strut at this point. Just 5 bolts. They come out very easily. And we also, before we want to take all those nuts off, we want to break the bolt on the top hat loose so that once we get our strut out and we want to remove this top hat nut, it's going to be a lot easier because we got some rust on there. And if you loosen this nut before you get the strut out, it makes your life so much easier when you go to release the nut on the top hat after you've compressed the springs. And I'm also going to throw a little WD-40 on there to make it even easier. Okay, now I was able to pull the shock out without any problems and separate the fork. And now I'm just kind of looking those over to make sure there was no damage. I didn't really see much. So now I'm going to reinstall the upper control arm, the brand new one. What I didn't show was that before I took the old upper control arm out, that I took a marker and marked the inside of the wheel well so I would know where to hang the new upper control arm, because it just wants to drift down when you first bolt it back in. So once you get it tightened up a little bit, and you're going to tighten it to 23 foot-pounds with a torque wrench, you want to get it in almost exactly where the original manufacturer's position was. And I think the easiest way, without doing a bunch of calculations or measurements, is just to mark on the inside of the wheel well right there with a black marker or silver marker, whatever you have, and get it as close as you can to the original one. Okay, now that we've got our strut out of the wheel well, we can go ahead and compress the springs to remove the shock and replace that. I actually bought my own spring compressors, and I'll leave a link below from Amazon. You can get a pretty good deal, or you can rent them from O'Reilly's or AutoZone and get your money back when you're all done with them. Just make sure that when you place these spring compressors on, that they're spaced evenly across from each other. And it'll compress it much better if you have a nice even spacing on there. So once we get them all set up, we can get our torque gun out, and we can go ahead and slowly, back and forth, side to side, we'll just tighten the spring a little at a time. Don't go too crazy. We don't want to over tighten anything too fast. We just want to take our time here to compress the spring evenly. Okay, now that you've got the spring compressed enough to where you can actually rotate the shock by hand, then you're ready to remove the top hat nut, and you're just gonna need an Allen key and an opening wrench to do it. And it's a good thing that we actually broke this nut loose a little bit while it was still in the car, because this thing is a little rusty and it's really hard to get loose. And it took me a little while to break this thing loose. But once you finally do get it off, pay close attention to the orientation of all of the washers on the shock. There's quite a few, and you really just want to pay special attention to the orientation, because when you put it back together, you want to put it back together right. So just lay them out one by one so you don't lose track of everything. There's quite a few little washers on the inside of the shock that you'll have to replace, and we'll kind of walk through that in a minute. But just take it out slowly and look at everything that's involved here. There's quite a bit going on. Okay, now that we've got the shock out of the assembly, we need to save this bump stop, and this washer is often stuck, so just knock it loose with a little rubber mallet and keep this washer here and the bump stop. And I like to just place them to the side in the correct orientation they came off of, so I don't lose track of what it's supposed to look like. And I've actually got some overnight parts from Japan. I got a KYB shock, which is an actual upgrade for this car. It's a little bit better than the one that came out of it, so that's kind of nice. It's a little beefier. And what we want to do now is replace a bunch of rubber grommets and little washers that came with it. And the shock comes complete with all those parts. So we'll just have to open that up and replace them one by one. And we can go ahead and reassemble the whole strut. Now, it does come with directions, but they're in Japanese, so luckily for us, there's some pictures on the back that make it pretty easy. Okay, before we put the new shock in, we do have this little, I'm going to call it a rubber donut on top of the top hat and one underneath, held together with a little thin metal tube. So we do need to replace those. The new shock comes with the replacement parts. Just pay close attention to the orientation here, and I'm just going to put it back together the way I found it, so I can use that as sort of like a little diagram of how to replace the new parts. And the top hat was quite dirty, so I cleaned that up, and then I was ready to replace these little rubber donuts with a little metal tube into the top hat. Okay, now that we've got the rubber grommets placed back in properly, we can go ahead and place the shock back in to the strut assembly. Make sure that you've got all of your washers oriented correctly. Hopefully you paid close attention to the position when you took them off. Make sure that you don't forget to put your bump stop back onto the shock and that little washer that goes on top. If you look in the lower right hand part of my screen, you can see what? My bump stop. So I totally blew it and released the springs after I put everything back together and realized that my bump stop was off. So make sure that you don't forget your bump stop. Okay, now it's time to remove the lower ball joint from the knuckle, and I had to rent a specialty tool from O'Reilly's, a Honda ball joint removal kit. It comes with 3 different little spacers and then a 23-piece just basic ball joint removal kit from AutoZone. That still wasn't enough. I still had to do some modifications to get this little ball joint out. And the problem was, if you can see this ball joint was kind of worn out, so it was very malleable and it was moving around. And I couldn't find a spacer that would actually completely cover the ball joint, the bottom of the ball joint, and end up flush with the knuckle. So I decided to get my trusty Dremel out and just cut the bottom of that little joint off so it would be flush, and then it would make it so much easier to just push out. So you can, if you have a Dremel, that would be very helpful at this point to get this off, and or you could use a hacksaw, but it would take you quite a long time. So try to find a Dremel if you can. You can just cut the bottom of this thing off and press it out really easy. Okay, now that we've got that cut off, it'll be so much easier to press out. You're definitely going to have need this Honda specific spacer with the flush backside that fits right into the knuckle, and you're not going to be able to do it without it. You can also purchase one on Amazon. They're pretty cheap. I'll leave a link below. And once you get that in there, then you can put this little washer, or I'm going to put a little washer on the other side. Then I'm going to put the C-clamp on to that, line it all up, then get my impact driver and push this thing out. I also hit it with a lot of PB Blaster, so that might help push it out. So take your time, make sure it's lined up so we don't damage anything, and then you can push it out with your impact driver. Okay, now that I got the C-clamp off, I got the actual spacer stuck onto the knuckle. So I just took a little ball peen hammer, hit a couple times, it popped right off. And now I'm gonna finish it up with this ball peen hammer. I'm just gonna keep tapping it till it pops out. Okay, once you finally get your old ball joint tapped out, you're ready to put the new one in. And first thing we're gonna do is take this castle nut off so we can remove this rubber boot. We don't want to insert it with the rubber boot on. And there's a ring clip that has to be removed first. So I'm going to take this 90-degree angle pick, but you do not want to puncture that boot, so be very, very careful. Don't puncture your boot. But if you can see, I slid that under the ring clip and I'm pulling it off now, and now that I've got it halfway off, I can remove it with my hand. And then once I get that off, I can remove the rubber boot. And once you get the rubber boot off, it's really easy to press into the knuckle. You just don't want to press it in with the boot on because you could damage the boot itself. So put a little grease around this part right here and it should slide into the knuckle a lot easier. Okay, now I'm going to apply some grease into the knuckle itself. That should really make it slide in a lot easier. And we'll obviously put some on the outside of the ball joint. So now I'm just going to slide the ball joint into the knuckle and it fits perfect, which is always great when your ball joint fits. And now we can get this spacer. And I got this spacer from the Universal Ball Joint Kit, the one from AutoZone. And that fit on the backside really well. And I got a little flat disc from the Honda specific ball joint kit. And now I can just place on my C-clamp and get my impact driver out. And this thing fit like a glove, so you can just press it right in. It was really pretty easy. It just shot right in, maybe because of all the grease we used. So once you get that pushed in, you are almost home free. Okay, now what we're going to do is replace the snap ring on the lower ball joint. Now I didn't show the removal of the snap ring, on the other ball joint that we took out because there was no snap ring. I don't know who put it in, but they decided not to or forgot to put the snap ring on. But this one comes with a brand new snap ring, and I have a snap ring tool. But if you don't have one, it's okay. You can use a pair of needle nose pliers and basically accomplish this the same way. So whatever you have available, use that to get the snap ring back in. It's basically a safety mechanism to keep that ball joint from slipping out. It kind of locks it in there. Once you get the snap ring locked in, you can go ahead, and I'm going to add just a little more grease to the boot because I want to make sure it's nice and lubed up. Then we can slide the boot on and make sure that it snaps on and snaps in place so it's nice and snug. And we can put this ring back around the boot, and you just stretch the ring out. You can do it by hand here. Once you stretch it, you can slide it over the boot and snap it into place. It's a lot easier to put back on than it was to take off. So just take your time, and with all that grease involved, it should just slide down and back over the boot. Now that we've got that on, I'm going to put a little grease around the bearings themselves, but be careful. Don't forget about the speed sensor, and there's a little gap or a little slot, and you can see towards the top left, I got a little grease in there, so I had to wipe that out. But leave that area alone. You don't want to get grease in the slot for the speed sensor. I wanted to mention something that I didn't show on film, is that there's a thin little metal covering or sheath that goes over the top of the bearings here that you have to use a flathead screwdriver to pop off. And once you get this outside of the bearings coated with some grease, don't forget to pop that little shield back on. It basically just keeps dirt and grime out of the bearings. So I didn't show that at all, but you have to remove it to remove the ball joint, and you will see it once you remove the knuckle. Okay, now we're ready to reinsert the knuckle with the brand new ball joint back into the car. You can see I've already put the outer tie rod in. I actually put an inner tie rod in. I didn't really get that on film, but we may be able to do a video on that later. And I've got the strut placed back in and the lower control arm. So you see I've added a lot of grease around the outside of the drive axle right there and grease up those splines as well. Now I'm going to reinsert the new ball joint back into the lower control arm, so just take your time so you don't damage anything. It should slide in pretty easily. It may not slide in all the way because you may have to put the nut on the bottom and tighten it up to get it to completely slide in. But now I am actually taking the drive axle and working it into the bearing assembly. Now with everything lubed up, it should slide right on in to the bearing assembly. So take your time, and I had to get a good angle on it. That's what I'm doing right here. I'm kind of adjusting things so I can get that drive axle lined up just right. And once you get it lined up just right, it should pop in. Boom, it popped right in. You can see it's sticking out right there. So that was nice. It just popped right in there. No, almost effortlessly. So now I can just throw the little nut on there so it doesn't slide back out. We don't want that to fall back out. And once we get the nut loosely placed on there, then we can go ahead and get a jack underneath the knuckle and push it up into the upper control arm. So what I want to do is just get it high enough so I can grab the upper control arm at this point, and you can pull the upper control arm down and pop it into the knuckle. You know what I mean? Pop it, I mean pop the upper ball joint into the knuckle. So now we can take that castle nut, tighten it down by hand to keep that upper control arm lodged in the knuckle while we come back down below, add a little up force, grab our torque wrench and torque this lower ball joint to spec. Once we get that all torqued down to spec, we can go to the upper control arm and torque that to spec, and then we are done with this whole project almost. So I went ahead and painted the calipers and threw some new brake shoes on. Also grabbed some brand new rotors because they were quite rusty, and I just wanted to do a quick review of everything we replaced. We replaced the upper control arms, which came with brand new ball joints in them already. We put some KYB shocks in both sides, lower control arm, and we've also put inner and outer tie rods in and brand new end links. And then I threw some new cotter pins on everything. And now I think we're ready to take this thing down to Firestone and get an alignment and just see how bad or how good it is. So cross your fingers. And here are the results. Caster camber good on the undamaged side. That's nice. And then on the damaged side, we would expect it to be off. Caster was off, and so was toe. So no huge surprise there at all. And in the rear, let's see what we got. Just the toe off, so that probably means that the no damage to the rear is what I'm thinking, which is great news. All we have to do is replace the rear struts and we'll be good to go on those. And then after they've done their alignment, boom, look at that. Only thing off is the caster on the damaged side, which I'm thinking maybe if I replace that sway bar, that might bring the caster back into spec. We'll see. I'll try to get a hold of one of those later on and replace that. In the rear, look at that. Everything lines up perfect and the thing drives really, really well. So it was definitely worth all that hard work. And I think this is a success on the project. So if this helped you out, please like and subscribe. Z-Speed will be back soon for another. And just keep on repairing.